poisoned woods of Denata. Shiprock, New Mexico, was a quiet pulse in the heart of Denata, its red rock mesas guarding a land sacred to the Navajo, but scarred by unseen poisons. I stood on the edge of my childhood home, the wind carrying whispers of my ancestors, their teachings of guardianship a fire in my soul. The town was small, its streets a map of pride. But beyond the horizon, the earth bled from wounds left by mining companies, their uranium a curse that seeped into our rivers and soil. I was a son of this land, sworn to protect it. But the woods south of Church Rock held secrets darker than radiation, truths that stirred in the shadows, waiting to be seen. The Northern Navajo Nation Fair was a heartbeat, its drums echoing each fall, a celebration of culture that shaped me from boyhood. I grew up steeped in pride, taught to honor Denata, our homeland, a sacred trust passed through generations. The land was our kin, its rivers our veins, its forests our breath. But the mines had torn its flesh, their waste a poison that lingered. The world beyond spoke of peace and love, of harmony with nature. But here, harmony was a fight, a call I felt deep in my bones, a duty to heal what was broken, to stand for a land that couldn't speak. My friends dreamed of warrior paths, their eyes on the military, their hearts on defending the nation. But I saw no enemies in San Juan County, only scars left by greed. The mines were the threat, their uranium a silent killer, their abandoned pits a betrayal of the earth. I chose a different shield, a scholar's path, my mind a weapon, my goal to protect Denata from within. The University of New Mexico was my forge, its classrooms a fire where I shaped my purpose, my degree in environmental science a vow to fight for the land, a truth I carried like a prayer. The EPA was my chance, its Region 6 office, a beacon in New Mexico, a call to serve the land I loved. The interview was a test, my bolo tie a badge, my words a bridge between science and spirit, a Navajo's knowledge of the earth's pulse. The job was mine, a dream woven from years of study and fieldwork, a step toward healing Denata's wounds. But the land had its own plans, its pain a cry that shook me, a catastrophe that came too soon, a spill that turned rivers to poison, a truth that burned in the quiet, a mystery that grew in the dark. Church Rock was a wound, its uranium mill a scar, its dam a lie that broke, unleashing a tide of radioactive waste that choked the Puerco River, a betrayal that scarred the land and its people. I was there, my boots in the mud, my Geiger counter ticking, my heart heavy with the land's pain. A scientist and a Navajo caught in a storm of poison. The woods south of the spill held secrets, their trees tainted, their air heavy, their shadows alive with truths I'd face alone. A mutated deer, a sphere of fire, a dying man, encounters that tested my soul, a Denata that spoke in whispers, a land that demanded I listen. I grew up in a little place called Shiprock, New Mexico, which is home to the Northern Navajo Nation Fair. It rolls around every fall for a couple of days, and like most kids around there, I was taught to have a lot of pride in my people and my culture, especially when it came to the concept of our guardianship over the land. I wanted to protect Denata, which is the Navajo word for our homeland. By the time I got to high school, a lot of my friends were dead set on joining the military as a way of doing just that. It was good money. It invoked the warrior spirit of our ancestors. And if you were defending the USA, then you were helping defend the Navajo too, right? I guess a lot of people thought that way, but me personally, I thought they were crazy. What was in San Juan and had been since before I was born were a whole bunch of mining companies who didn't always play by the rules when it came to disposing of toxic waste products. The land was my kin, its scars my fight, a duty that called me, a truth that led me to Church Rock, a Denata that held secrets darker than poison, a mystery I'd carry forever. Shiprock was a cradle, its mesas a shield, but the land beyond was wounded, its rivers poisoned by the greed of mining companies, their uranium a curse that lingered in Denata's veins. I can't put it all on the mining companies' unregulated grazing and industrial encroachment had also left scars on the land, but the mining companies had a bad reputation for a damn good reason because the uranium mines they left abandoned had leached poison into our soil and water. They did the most damage. The mines were a betrayal. Their waste a silent killer, a truth I saw in the newsreels, a call I answered with my mind, not a gun. So to me, it was them that Denata needed protecting from most. So instead of choosing a warrior's path, I chose a scholar's. I graduated from the University of New Mexico with a bachelor's degree in environmental science. In 1970, the campus was a forge, its lectures a fire. My volunteer work with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs, a spark that lit my path. But in between study sessions, I was volunteering with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs. Working with those programs was a work experience gold mine. The land spoke to me. Its scars a lesson, its rivers a cry I couldn't ignore. Then after graduation, I heard from a professor that the EPA was hiring in Region 6, which covered my home state of New Mexico. The opportunity was a beacon, its application a test, my resolve a shield against the weight. The application process was long and tiresome, but after months of waiting, I got a call back for an interview. My bolo tie was my armor. My words a bridge between science and spirit, a Navajo's truth. I wore my best bolo tie and spoke plainly about why I wanted the job. And while I leaned on my fieldwork and studies, I also made it clear that I knew the land as a Navajo, not just as a scientist. The interview was a dance, my knowledge a rhythm, my passion a pulse. A few weeks later, I was offered a position as an environmental scientist with the EPA's Region 6 office based in New Mexico, and it was a dream come true. I started in early 1970. While the work was challenging, every sample I took and every report I wrote was a step toward protecting our ancestral lands. The EPA was my shield, its mission my vow. Each soil sample a prayer for Denata's healing. I carried the weight of my ancestors' teachings, their respect for Mother Earth, into every meeting and every field assignment. The land was my kin, its pulse my guide, its wounds my fight. A truth I held close, but the land had its own plans, its pain a storm that broke too soon, a catastrophe that shook the earth, a spill that turned rivers to poison, a truth that tested my soul. Just 5 months into my job, the land that I had sworn to protect faced a catastrophe that shook all of us to our cores. The Church Rock spill was a wound, its uranium mill a scar, its dam a lie that unleashed a tide of radioactive waste. In the morning of July 19, at around 5:30 a dam at the uranium mills up in Church gave way. The breach was a scream, its poison a flood, a betrayal that scarred Dinata. The breach unleashed over 1,000 tons of radioactive mill tailings, which is sandy radium-laced debris from uranium processing, and 94 million gallons of radioactive wastewater into the Plurko River, which then flowed downstream by around 80 miles through McKinley and Navajo counties. The spill was a thunderclap, its impact a shadow that darkened the land, its silence a cry that went unheard. The spill was even worse than the Three River Island accident which happened earlier that year. But to our shock, we barely made the news. I was there, my boots in the mud, my Geiger counter a pulse, my heart heavy with the land's pain, a Navajo and a scientist, a guardian caught in a storm, a truth that led me deeper, a Dinata that spoke in poison, a mystery that grew in the woods, a fight I'd never leave. The Church Rock spill was a betrayal, its radioactive tide a wound that scarred Dinata, its silence a cry that echoed in my soul, a truth that called me to act. As a Region 6 employee, I was thrown into action almost right away. My team was a shield, our samples a sword, our mission a prayer for the land. I joined the teams collecting water and soil samples, and we quickly determined radiation levels in the Porter River were over 7,000 times the level we'd considered dangerous. The Geiger counter screamed, its clicks a chorus, the river a poison that flowed through Navajo hearts. We put signs up warning people to avoid the river, but many Navajo families either didn't get the news or had no other choice. The signs were frail, their warnings ignored, the river a lifeline turned traitor. Goat herders, for example, were some of the worst affected. Their livestock drank from the river and later died or gave birth to deformed or inviable offspring. The land wept, its animals a sacrifice. The herder's loss a wound that cut deep. Then, to make matters worse, the governor refused to declare a federal disaster area, which left many Navajo communities without aid they urgently required. The refusal was a slap, its silence a betrayal, a truth that hardened my resolve. I knew I was needed at Church Rock, and I knew I could do some good there, so within 24 hours of returning from the testing teams, I was pushing for a transfer. My voice was a cry, my experience a shield, my supervisors a gate I pressed. I pressed my supervisors, arguing that my experience with the Navajo Nation's environmental programs made me ideal for the task. My fieldwork was my proof, my Navajo roots my fire, a truth they couldn't ignore. And then in September of '79, my persistence paid off. The EP approved my reassignment to a long-term monitoring project focused on the Church Rock area, specifically targeting the spread of radioactive contamination beyond the river into surrounding ecosystems. The assignment wouldn't be a glamorous one. There'd be long hours, limited funding, and the obvious dangers of trudging around a potentially radioactive forest all day, but it also meant an opportunity to serve Dinata directly. So without a moment's hesitation, I took it. The woods were my battlefield, their trees my kin, their soil a pulse I'd read. From the fall of '70 to the winter of '81, I was based out of McGaffey, a small town in the Missouri Mountains about 20 minutes south of Church Rock. McGaffey was a haven, its quiet a refuge, its distance a shield against the spill's shadow. My work revolved around weekly trips into the wooded area south of the spill, where its toxic plume had spread through runoff and wind. The forest was a wound, its air heavy, its silence a lie. There, I'd test trees and soil for radioactive contamination, which posed long-term risk to plants, animals, and people. My Geiger counter was my guide. Its clicks a truth, the samples a prayer for healing. Every Monday I'd load up my truck in McGaffey with sampling equipment, gear counter, soil corers, and containers for plant samples. Then make the 20 Mimos drive to Church Rock, past warning signs faded by the sun and dry washes still stained with a dirt yellow sediment. The woods were a maze, their grid, my map. My boots, a pulse that stirred the earth, a Navajo in a poisoned land, a scientist with a sacred task. In the woods, I followed a grid system mapped out by my EPA colleagues, spending hours taking tree clippings and collecting the soil samples to check for radioactive particles. The results were a cry, their numbers a wound, a truth that burned, and the results horrified me. The radiation levels in some of my soil samples were over 100 times higher than normal, and certain trees showed elevated radioactivity in their bark and needles. I documented each sample, my reports a shield, a truth that pushed for cleanup, a denata that demanded I fight, a mystery that deepened in the woods, a land that spoke in poison, a duty I'd never leave. The woods south of Church Rock were a wounded heart, their trees tainted, their soil a silent scream, a denata poisoned by the spill's radioactive tide, a truth that pulsed in my work. I documented everything, knowing the data I collected could make all the difference when it came to getting the cleanup right. My reports were a cry, their numbers a weapon, a hope for healing the land I loved. It hurt knowing that I wasn't in a position to outright prevent things like that from happening in the first place, but helping drive the cleanup made me feel like I was really making a difference. The work was my shield, its purpose, my fire. A Navajo's vow to protect denata, a scientist's fight against poison. I don't regret all the time that I spent helping out. I wouldn't change a thing. But let's just say that I had one or two encounters that made me think that there might be scarier things than radiation out in those woods. The forest was alive, its shadows a chorus, its silence a lie that hid truths I'd face alone. You see, in the fall of 1980, about a year into my weekly trips into the woods south of Church Rock, I had an encounter that seriously rattled me, not just as a scientist, but as a Navajo with ties to the land. The woods were my kin, their pain my own. A truth that stirred in the quiet, a mystery that grew in the dark. I was out there working a grid near a dry wash about a mile south of the spill site when suddenly I saw it, a small, mutated yearling deer that stopped me in my tracks. The air was heavy, the wash a scar, my Geiger counter a soft tick in the silence. I had just stood up after seeing a soil sample, my gear counter softly ticking away when I heard a rustle. My eyes lifted, expecting a coyote, but the deer was there, a ghost in the clearing. I looked up expecting a rabbit or maybe a coyote, but instead, there it was no taller than my waist, standing around 20 feet away in a rough clearing. Its form was wrong, its presence a wound, a truth that froze my heart. It wasn't aggressive. It just stared at me with one cloudy eye. The other was missing, and there was just a sunken socket in its place, while its head was lopsided from a bulging tumor that pushed its skull out of shape. The deer's gaze was a cry, its deformities a scream, a Navajo's harmony broken. Its legs were all wrong, with the front right so bent that it hobbled even while standing still, and its fur was patchy too, with bald spots showing scabby discolored skin and a stunted tail that was barely a nub. Its body was a map of pain, its breath shallow, a life twisted by poison. It didn't move toward me or flee, it just stood there with its breathing very shallow, like it was too weak to do much of anything else. The clearing was still, the deer's stare a pulse, a truth I couldn't turn from. And my first thought was radiation chronic exposure causing mutations, especially in younger animals developing in contaminated areas. Science was my shield, its logic a guide, but the deer was more akin betrayed. This deer's deformities, its cranial asymmetry, missing eye and limb malformation, were almost an exact match with the kinds of things folks saw at Chernobyl in the years that followed. The Puerco River was a wound, its poison a tide, the deer its victim, a truth that cut deep. The Puerto River was still in a radiated mess, and the deer either drank from it, grazed on contaminated plants, or its mother drank from it while pregnant and passed the poison on. The land was my kin, its pain my own, a Navajo's duty to see, to act. I noted the location in my field book and made a note of that deer's deformities. My pen was a cry, my report a prayer, a truth that pushed for healing. The deer limped away, its shadow a wound, a dinita that spoke in pain, a mystery that lingered, a truth I'd carry, a forest that wasn't silent, a land that demanded I fight. The deer's limping form was a scar on my soul, its twisted body a cry from Dineta, a truth that pulsed in the poisoned woods south of Church Rock, a mystery that deepened my fight. It made for a very terrifying sight, but as a Navajo, the sight hit deeper. Our ancestors teach us to live in harmony with animals, almost like their family. So seeing this fawn all twisted up and suffering like that, it felt like a violation of that harmony. The forest was my kin, its creatures my siblings, their pain a wound I felt in my bones, a Navajo's vow broken by poison, a scientist's data a call to act. I checked my gear counter and it spiked slightly, about 0.22 megagram per hour higher than the surrounding area. This suggested the young deer might have been exposed to contaminated sediment. The numbers were a truth, their spike a scream, a land betrayed by greed. I didn't approach it, partly to avoid scaring it and partly because I didn't want to risk contamination. My distance was a shield, my caution a prayer. The deer's suffering a weight I carried. It watched me for maybe a minute and then limped off into the trees. Its departure was a whisper, its shadow a pulse, a truth that lingered in the clearing. I didn't follow. Instead, I marked the spot for follow-up sampling, knowing that I need to report the encounter to my EPO team as soon as possible. My field book was a cry, its pages a map, a scientist's duty to document, a Navajo's heart to heal. We'd seen sick livestock. A lot of Navajo herders had lost sheep with similar deformities. But that was my first direct encounter with a wild animal so clearly affected by the spill, and I'm not ashamed to say that it left me very, very shaken. The herder's loss was a wound, their sheep a kin, the deer a mirror to their pain, a truth that shook my core. I drove back to McGaffey that evening with a heavy heart. My data would go into a report, and I could no doubt use it to push for more cleanup, but the feeling that poor animal gave me was something that I couldn't put into words. The truck's hum was a lullaby, the stars a witness, my prayers a plea for Dineta's healing. The deer was a ghost, its deformities a cry, a land that spoke in pain, a Navajo's duty to listen, a scientist's fight to act. The report was a step, its numbers a truth, a push for cleanup, a hope for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a mystery that grew in the dark. The woods were a maze, their shadows a chorus, their silence a lie that hid deeper wounds. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a tie, the deer a victim, a kin I couldn't save. I worked my grids, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Dineta, a land that wept for its children. The herder's loss was a cry, their livestock a sacrifice, the forest a stage for pain, a truth that hardened my resolve. The EPA was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own. A Navajo's fight against poison, a scientist's search for truth. The nights in McGaffey were quiet, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the deer's shadow, a truth I'd never shed. The spill was a scar, its impact a wound, the land a cry that echoed in my work, a duty that led me deeper, a forest that wasn't silent, a Dineta that demanded I see. The deer was a ghost, its pain a truth, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data a call, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a truth that pulsed in my fight, a land that spoke in poison, a duty I'd carry forever. The deer's shadow was a wound in my heart, its limping form a cry from Dineta, a truth that pulsed through the poisoned woods, a mystery that deepened my resolve to protect the land. The Church Rock spill was a betrayal, its radioactive tide a scar that scarred the Puerco River, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a truth that called me to act. The forest south of the spill was a maze, its trees tainted, its soil a silent stream, a Navajo's kin wounded by greed, a scientist's mission to heal, a duty that led me deeper, a land that spoke in whispers, a mystery that grew in the dark. The woods were alive, their shadows a chorus, their silence a stage for truths I'd face alone, a Dineta that demanded I listen. The spill's poison was a tide, its impact a wound, the land a cry that echoed in my work, a duty that hardened my soul. I moved through the grids, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect the land I loved, a truth that burned in the quiet, a mystery that pulsed in the forest, a fight I'd never leave. The herder's loss was a scar, their livestock a kin, the deer a mirror to their pain, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data a call to act. The nights in McGaffey were a refuge, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the land's pain, a truth I'd never shed. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the forest a stage for wounds I couldn't heal, a duty that led me deeper, a Dineta that spoke in poison, a mystery that lingered in the woods. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own, a Navajo's fight against greed, a scientist's search for balance, a truth that pulsed in my work, a mystery that grew in the dark. The forest was a wounded heart, its trees a cry, its stale a pulse that spoke of pain, a dynata that demanded I see, a truth that hardened my resolve. I worked my grids, my boots a rhythm, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect the land, a Navajo's duty to listen, a scientist's fight to heal. The spill was a scar, its impact a wound, the land a cry that echoed in my soul, a truth that led me deeper, a forest that wasn't silent, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a fight I'd carry forever. The woods held secrets, their shadows a stage, their silence a lie that hid truths I'd face, a denata that spoke in pain, a truth that burned in my heart. The Puerco River was a wound, its waters a poison, its banks a cry for the herders who lost their kin, a Navajo's harmony broken by greed, a scientist's data a call to act. I stood in the forest, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Denata, a land that wept for its children, a truth that hardened my soul. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a tide, the forest a stage for pain, a mystery that deepened my fight, a duty that led me deeper, a land that spoke in whispers, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The nights in McGaffey were quiet, their stars a witness, my prayers a plea for balance, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's fight to see. The deer was a ghost, its deformities a cry, a land that spoke in pain, a truth that lingered in the woods, a mystery that grew in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's search for truth, a denata that demanded I fight, a mystery that pulsed in the poisoned woods, a truth I'd carry forever. The poisoned woods of Church Rock were a cry from Dinata, their tainted trees a pulse of pain, their shadows a stage for secrets I'd face, a truth that deepened my fight to protect the land. The spill was a betrayal, its radioactive tide a wound that scarred the Puerco River, its silence a lie that hid the land's suffering, a Navajo's kin wounded by greed, a scientist's mission to heal, a duty that led me deeper, a mystery that grew in the dark. The forest was alive, its air heavy, its still a silent scream, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The deer's deformities were a scar, its limping form a cry that echoed in my soul, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data a call to act. The herder's loss was a wound, their livestock akin, the forest a stage for pain, a truth that hardened my resolve. I moved through the grids, my boots a rhythm, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Denata, a land that wept for its children, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a duty that burned in my heart. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the land a cry that demanded I see, a truth that led me deeper, a fight I'd carry forever. The nights in McGaffey were a refuge, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the land's pain, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's fight to see. The forest was a wounded heart, its trees a cry, its soil a pulse that spoke of pain, a dynata that demanded I listen, a truth that pulsed in my work, a mystery that grew in the dark. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, But the land was my kin, its wounds my own. A Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's search for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd never leave. The woods held secrets, their shadows a chorus, their silence a lie that hid truths I'd face alone. A Dinata that spoke in poison, a mystery that deepened my resolve. Sometime after, in the summer of 1981, I was still heading out on my weekly monitoring trips when a wildfire broke out in the woods south of Church Rock. The forest was a tinderbox, its air dry, its trees a silent cry waiting for a spark. One of my co-workers, a fellow scientist named Tom, got caught in the fire's path, and what he claimed to have seen while escaping left me wrestling with both my scientific skepticism and my Navajo roots. As such, it had been an unusually hot and dry July, and the woods were a tinderbox after weeks without rain. The heat was a weight, the sun a blade, the forest a stage for its own destruction. Tom had gone out early to collect water samples from a wash near our monitoring grid about 2 minutes south of the spill site. His truck was a speck, his samples a prayer, a scientist's duty in a poisoned land. I was in McGaffey testing samples when we got word of smoke rising from the trees, and by morning, reports were coming in of a fast-spreading fire that wind was pushing southwest directly toward our monitoring area. I was in the office coordinating with our team when we lost contact with the Tom. The fire was moving too quickly for us to send a truck, and the Forest Service was already stretched thin. The smoke was a veil, the fire a roar, our fear a pulse that grew. We just had to sit tight and pray that he'd be okay. The hours were a wait, our prayers a cry, a truth that held us fast. The forest was alive, its flames a dance, its shadows a stage for secrets. A Dinata that spoke in fire, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a truth that burned in my heart, a fight I'd carry forever. The wildfire south of Church Rock was a cry from Dinata, its flames a pulse of pain, its smoke a veil that hid secrets in the poisoned woods, a truth that deepened my fight to protect the land. Well, our prayers were answered, and by late afternoon, firefighters found Tom staggering out of the woods near Red Rock. His form was a ghost, his face black with soot, his cough a cry that broke the silence. He was barely conscious, black with soot, and coughing violently from the severe smoke inhalation. But he was alive. The relief was a tide, his survival a spark, a truth that held us fast. Firefighters rushed him to Gallup Indian Medical Center, where he was treated for burns and respiratory damage. The hospital was a refuge, its lights a shield, Tom's recovery a hope in the dark. When I visited him the next day, I was relieved to see him alive, but I was incredibly shaken by how close we'd come to losing him. His eyes were weary, his voice a whisper, a scientist caught in a storm, a truth that burned in my heart. About a week later, when Tom was stable, he gave a statement to the firefighters, and as an EPA official, I got my hands on a copy of their report. The report was a map, its words a pulse, a truth that unveiled secrets. It detailed Tom's escape, and as harrowing as it all was, one part stopped me dead cold. The fire was a roar, its smoke a veil, Tom's flight a cry for life. Tom said he'd been collecting samples when he noticed the burning smell, and assuming it was some campers that had strayed too far into the exclusion zone, he started walking towards the flame. His steps were steady, his curiosity a spark, a scientist's duty in a poisoned land. Then, by the time he realized it was a forest fire, the flame was already visible through the trees and the smoke was thickening fast. The fire was a tide, its heat a blade, a truth that forced him to run. With the fire closing in, he dropped his gear and just ran. But as he fled, he claimed that he saw something impossible, a huge sphere of flame about 6 feet, around floating slowly through the woods, maybe 10 to fear it off the ground. The sphere was a ghost, its glow a mystery, a truth that defied the fire's roar. He said it moved steadily, not flickering like regular flames, but burning up tree trunks as it moved through them. And although he admitted the smoke and the panic made everything a little blurry, he swore it wasn't any kind of hallucination and that he knew what he'd seen. His words were a cry, his vision a pulse, a truth that shook my core. The firefighters' report noted that Tom's account of the sphere was likely a stress-induced misperception of either a large burning branch or debris caught in an updraft. Their logic was a shield, their data a truth. A fire's chaos explained they'd seen no evidence of anything unusual in the burn patterns, just a typical fast-moving wildfire that scorched around 100 acres before containment. The report was a map, its findings a wall, a truth that buried Tom's claim. But as a Navajo, I felt the land's pulse, its pain a cry that echoed in my soul, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a truth that pulsed in the dark. But while reading the report in my office, I wasn't so quick to dismiss it. As a Navajo, I'd grown up hearing from elders about strange lights in the woods, small orbs of flame, sometimes called witch lights, that are signs of restless spirits. The stories were a thread, their truths a part, a Navajo's wisdom passed through time. My grandmother once told me of glowing balls of flame seen at night near sacred sites, and that they were sometimes tied to imbalances in the land. The sphere was a sign, its glow a cry, a Dineta wounded by poison, a mystery that burned in my heart, a truth I'd carry forever. Tom's sphere of flame was a cry from Dineta, its glow a pulse in the poisoned woods, a mystery that wrestled with my Navajo roots and scientific mind, a truth that deepened my fight for the land. The woods south of Church Rock was now tainted by radioactive waste, and part of me wondered if Tom's sphere was a manifestation of that unrest. The forest was a wound, its air heavy, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Navajo's kin betrayed by greed, a scientist's mission to heal, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that pulsed in the dark. But the scientist in me pushed back hard. I'd studied fire behavior in my environmental science courses. Wildfires can create optical illusions like burning gases or superheated air distorting light. My training was a shield, its logic a guide, a fire's chaos explained. On top of that, Tom's smoke inhalation, in combination with carbon monoxide levels high enough to cause confusion, could have easily warped his perception. The science was clear, its data a truth, a mind clouded by smoke, a vision born of fear. I checked the fire's burn data and read samples from the area showing no unusual chemical residues, just the standard combustion markers you see in any regular forest fire. The numbers were a wall, their truth a pulse, a fire's path mapped, a sphere dismissed. Radiation levels in the soil already elevated from the spill hadn't spiked any further. In fact, the firefighters said they thought it was a freak lightning strike that started the blaze and that there was no physical evidence of anything like a floating sphere of flame. The report was a shield, its findings a truth, a fire's cause explained, a mystery buried. But I still couldn't shake that sense of unease. The land was my kin, its pain a cry, a Navajo's wisdom a pulse that lingered. I drove out to the burn site the following week and walked the charred section of the forest where Tom had been. The woods were ash, their trunks charred, a Denata wounded by fire, a truth that burned in my heart. The woods were this weird mix of ash and charred tree trunks, and my gear counter clicked at the expected level, nothing out of the ordinary. The numbers were a truth, their clicks a pulse, a land scarred but steady. But standing there, I felt the weight of the land's pain, not just from the spill, but the fire too. The forest was a cry, its silence a lie, a Navajo kin wounded, a scientist's duty to see. I said a quiet prayer for balance, not to mention Tom's recovery. And when I filed my report, his words were a reminder that some things in those woods defy explanation. My prayer was a pulse, my report a shield, a truth that pushed for healing, a mystery that lingered. The woods were a maze, their shadows a chorus, their silence a stage for secrets I'd face, a Denata that spoke in pain, a truth that hardened my resolve. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a tide, the fire a cry that echoed in my soul, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect the land, a Navajo's duty to listen, a scientist's fight to heal, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd never leave. The nights in McGaffey were a refuge, their stars a witness, my prayers a plea for Denata's healing, a Navajo's vow to fight, a scientist's search for truth. The sphere was a ghost, its glow a mystery, a land that spoke in fire, a truth that lingered in the woods, a mystery that grew in my work, a fight I'd carry forever. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's search for balance, a Denata that demanded I see, a truth that pulsed in the poisoned woods, a mystery I'd never forget. The sphere of flame was a whisper from Denata, its glow a pulse in the poisoned woods, a mystery that stirred my Navajo roots, a truth that deepened my fight for the land. The Church Rock spill was a betrayal, its radioactive tide a wound that scarred the Puerco River, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Navajo's kin wounded by greed, a scientist's mission to heal, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The forest was alive, its shadows a chorus, its silence a stage for secrets I'd face, a Denata that demanded I listen, a mystery that grew in the woods. The fire was a cry, its smoke a veil, Tom's escape a spark that lit the land's pain, a truth that burned in my heart. The deer was a ghost, its deformities a wound, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data, a call to act. The woods were a maze, their trees tainted, their soil a silent scream, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Dineta, a land that wept for its children, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a duty that burned in my soul. The nights in McGaffey were quiet, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the land pain, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's search for truth. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse. The forest a stage for wounds I couldn't heal, a truth that led me deeper, a Dineta that spoke in poison, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own. A Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd carry forever. The woods held secrets, their shadows a chorus, their slants a lie that hid truths I'd face alone. A Dineta that spoke in pain, a mystery that deepened my resolve. But as for other things, no matter how frightening they are, they often have very rational and logical explanations. Science was my shield, its logic a guide, a truth that explained the world, a mystery that buried fear. In the fall of 1909, just a few months into my reassignment to the cleanup effort, I witnessed something that haunts me to this day, something far worse than any mutated animal or wildfire scare. The forest was a wound, its air heavy, its silence a cry, a truth that broke my heart. I was out on a routine sampling trip in early September, and my grid that day had took me to a rocky outcrop about a 1.5 miles south of the spill site near a small cave tucked into a sandstone ridge. The outcrop was a scar, its cave a shadow, my Geiger counter a pulse in the quiet. I was testing the trees and soil for radium-226 with my gear counter clicking away when I heard a low groan from inside the cave. The sound was a wound, its pain a cry, a truth that froze my blood. It sounded like a wounded animal, maybe a coyote or a deer hurt and hiding, and I froze and listened. Then the sound came again, so guttural and full of pain that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I thought that it might be a sick animal, so I set down my gear and approached the mouth of the cave, calling out softly as to not startle whatever was inside. My voice was a whisper, my steps a prayer, a scientist's duty to see, a Navajo's heart to heal. The cave was a void, its darkness a pulse, a truth that waited, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a Dineta that spoke in pain, a truth that burned in my heart, a fight I'd carry forever. The groan from the cave was a cry from Dineta, its pain a pulse in the poisoned woods, a truth that shattered my heart, a mystery that deepened my fight for the land. Seconds after I started calling out, it crawled out into the sunlight and my stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, or at least what was left of one. The figure was a ghost, its form a wound, a Navajo's kin ravaged by poison, a scientist's nightmare unveiled. His skin was peeling off in patches, black, rotten, and oozing with sores that glistened in the light. His jaw was just kind of hanging slack, and his tongue lolled out of his mouth, very swollen, discolored, while his eyes were cloudy circles sunken in a face that looked more like a corpse than a living person. He dragged himself forward on bony arms, his legs too weak to stand, moaning with each movement. His groans were a cry, his body a map of pain, a truth that froze my blood. At first, I thought he was another mutation, like the animals that I'd feared. But as he emerged, I saw the tattered jeans he was wearing and realized this was a person that had been ravaged by advanced radiation sickness. The jeans were a thread, his humanity a pulse, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's truth unveiled, and my heart was pounding. Nothing I'd ever seen before had ever frightened me so much. But my training kicked in all the same. I knew acute radiation poisoning when I saw it, the skin, necrosis, the lesions, the way it looked like he was wasting away. This man had been exposed to extreme levels of radioactivity, likely from lingering in the spill zone, where radium and thorium saturated the soil and water. Science was my shield, its logic a guide, a truth that explained the horror, a mystery that broke my heart. I ran to my truck, grabbed my water canteen, and started begging for mechanics over my radio. My voice was a cry, my radio a lifeline, a scientist's duty to act, a Navajo's heart to save. I then ran back to the injured man, keeping my distance to avoid contamination, and offered him some water. The canteen was a prayer, my words a pulse, a truth that held him fast. He tried to drink it, but his throat was so swollen that he couldn't swallow, and he almost choked before coughing and expelling what he'd tried to drink. His cough was a wound, his pain a cry, a Navajo's kin betrayed by poison. His groans were weaker by then, his breathing very ragged. But I stayed with him, speaking softly and trying to reassure him he'd be okay until a Forest Service crew arrived with a stretcher. My voice was a shield, their stretcher a hope, a truth that carried him away. They rushed him to that medical center, but sadly, I learned later that he died in the hospital. The news was a weight. His death, a wound a Navajo's kin lost to greed, a scientist's fight renewed. The cave was a tomb, its darkness a pulse, a truth that lingered in the woods, a mystery that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the man a cry that echoed in my soul, a truth that hardened my resolve, a denata that spoke in pain, a mystery that burned in my heart. The forest was a wounded heart, its shadows a chorus, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's mission to heal. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Denata, a land that wept for its children, a truth that pulsed in the dark, a fight I'd carry forever. The man was a ghost, his groans a cry, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data a call, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a truth that burned in my soul, a Denata that demanded I fight. The man's groans were a cry from Denata, his rotting form a wound in the poisoned woods, a truth that shattered my soul, a mystery that deepened my fight for the land. My stale samples from near that cave showed radium levels 100 times above those considered safe enough to kill anyone who lingered there unprotected. The numbers were a scream, their truth a pulse, a cave-turned tomb by poison, a Navajo's kin betrayed by greed, a scientist's data a call to act. And later, I got my hands on a copy of that report. He was Hermit, a Navajo man in his 50s, who was known to live off and on in the woods near Church Rock. No one knew his full story. Some said that he'd been a miner, others said that he just preferred solitude. But what we knew for certain was he'd either ignored or never heard the EPA's warnings to stay away from the contaminated area. His life was a shadow, his solitude a cry. A Navajo's kin lost to poison, a truth that broke my heart. The spill's toxic plume had spread through the washes and into the caves where he likely took shelter. There was also a good chance that he'd been contaminated by drinking from tainted streams or eating tainted plants. The cave was a trap, its waters a curse, a land that killed its own, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. Autopsy reports confirmed lethal radiation exposure. His bone marrow was destroyed, his organs failing, and his skin was literally rotting from the inside out. The report was a wound, its findings a truth, a man's body a map of poison, a Navajo's kin betrayed by greed, a scientist's fight renewed. I was furious. And I wasn't the only one. The spill's radioactive tailings, left largely uncleaned by United Nuclear, had poisoned the land, and this man had paid the ultimate price. The anger was a fire, its truth a pulse, a company's greed a scar, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's call to act. I wrote it up in my report, pushing for more aggressive cleanup and better outreach to remote communities. My pen was a cry, my report a shield, a truth that pushed for healing, a mystery that lingered in the woods. I'd seen sick animals and polluted rivers, but this was different. He was one of us, at a loss to the poison we were fighting. The man was a kin. His death, a wound, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data, a prayer, a truth that burned in my heart, a fight I'd never leave. That night in McGaffey, I sat outside staring at the stars and prayed for forgiveness for not doing enough. But the conclusions to those prayers only hardened my resolve to keep testing and keep fighting, so that no one else had to crawl out of a cave rotting from the inside out while still alive. The stars were a witness, my prayers a pulse, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's fight to see, a truth that carried me forward, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. The woods were a wounded heart, their shadows a chorus, their silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a dinata that demanded I act, a truth that deepened my resolve. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect the land, a Navajo's duty to listen, a scientist's mission to heal, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd carry forever. The man was a ghost, his groans a cry, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's data a call, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a truth that pulsed in my soul, a dineta that spoke in pain, a fight I'd never forget. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the cave a tomb, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's fight renewed. The forest was alive, its shadows a stage, its silence a lie that hid secrets, a truth that led me deeper, a dineta that demanded I see, a mystery that burned in my heart, a fight I'd carry forever, a land that spoke in poison, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The hermit's death was a cry from dineta, his rotting form a wound in the poisoned woods, a truth that pulsed in my soul, a mystery that deepened my fight for the land. The church rock spill was a betrayal, its radioactive tide a scar that scarred the Puerco River, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Navajo's kin wounded by greed, a scientist's mission to heal, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that burned in the dark. The cave was a tomb, its shadows a chorus, its silence a stage for secrets, a deneta that demanded I act, a mystery that lingered in the woods. The man was a kin, his groans a cry, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's data a call to act. The deer was a ghost, its deformities a wound, a fire's sphere a mystery, a land that spoke in pain, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Deneta, a land that wept for its children, a mystery that burned in my heart, a duty that hardened my soul. The nights in McGaffey were a refuge, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the land's pain, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's search for truth. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the forest a stage for wounds I couldn't heal, a truth that led me deeper, a deneta that spoke in poison, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. The EPA was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd carry forever. The woods held secrets, their shadows a chorus, their silence a lie that hid truths I'd face alone, a Dineta that spoke in pain, a mystery that deepened my resolve. The cave was a wound, its man a cry, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's data a prayer, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The deer was a shadow, its deformities a scar, a fire's sphere a ghost, a land that spoke in whispers, a mystery that burned in my heart, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that lingered in the woods. The Puerco River was a wound, its waters a poison, its banks a cry for the herders who lost their kin, a Navajo's harmony broken by greed, a scientist's data a call to act. I stood in the forest, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer, each trip a vow to protect Deneta, a land that wept for its children, a truth that hardened my soul, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a tide, the forest a stage for pain, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's mission to heal, a truth that burned in my heart. The nights in McGaffey were quiet, their stars a witness, my prayers a plea for balance, a Navajo's vow to fight, a scientist's search for truth. The man was a ghost, his groans a cry, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's data a call, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a truth that pulsed in my soul, a deneta that spoke in pain, a fight I'd never forget. The EPA was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kits, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a mystery that pulsed in the poisoned woods, a fight I'd carry forever. The forest was a wounded heart, its shadows a chorus, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Denata that demanded I act, a truth that deepened my resolve, a mystery that burned in my heart, a fight I'd never leave, a land that spoke in poison, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The poisoned woods of Church Rock were a cry from Denata, their tainted trees a pulse of pain, their shadows a stage for secrets I'd face, a truth that deepened my fight to protect the land. The hermit's death was a wound, his groans a cry, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's data a call to act. The deer was a ghost, its deformities a scar, the sphere of flame a mystery, a land that spoke in pain, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The Puerco River was a wound, its waters a poison, its banks a cry for the herders who lost their kin, a Navajo's harmony broken by greed, a scientist's mission to heal. The forest was alive, its shadows a chorus, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a Denata that demanded I listen, a truth that burned in my heart. I moved through my grids, my boots a rhythm, my Geiger counter a pulse, my samples a prayer. Each trip a vow to protect the land, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's fight for balance, a mystery that pulsed in the dark. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the cave a tomb, a Navajo coon wounded by greed, a scientist's data a call to act, a truth that lingered in the woods. The nights in McGaffey were a refuge, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried the land's pain, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's search for truth. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire, but the land was my kin, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd carry forever. The woods held secrets, their shadows a stage, their silence a lie that hid truths I'd face. A Denata that spoke in poison, a mystery that deepened my resolve. The man was a cry, his rotting form a wound, a Navajo's kin lost to poison, a scientist's data a prayer, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The deer was a shadow, its deformities a scar, the sphere a ghost, a land that spoke in pain, a mystery that burned in my heart, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that lingered in the woods. The Puerco River was a wound, its waters a curse, its banks a cry for the herders, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's mission to heal, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The forest was a wounded heart, its shadows a chorus, its silence a lie that hid the land's pain. A Denata that demanded I act, a truth that deepened my resolve. And by the winter of 1981, my time at Church Rock had ended when the EPO reassigned me to other projects across New Mexico. The reassignment was a weight, its timing a cry, a truth that pulled me away. Resources were tight in the spill despite being the largest radioactive disaster in the nation's history, faded from the headlines, and the AY's focus shifted. The neglect was a betrayal, its silence a lie. A Navajo's forgotten, a scientist's fight renewed. I had to move on to new assignments. But the memories of Church Rock clung to me like the red dust on my boots. The dust was a scar, its weight a pulse, a truth that carried the land's pain. The mutated fawn limping through the woods, the strange fireball my co-worker swore he saw in the wildfire. And worst of all, that hermit crawling from the cave, his skin rotting from radiation sickness. All those images have been completely tattooed onto my consciousness. The memories were a fire, their truth a cry, a Navajo's hen wounded, a scientist's data a call, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a truth that burned in my heart. The spill was a wound, its poison a curse. The land a cry that echoed in my soul, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's fight to heal, a truth that led me deeper, a dineta that spoke in pain, a mystery that lingered in the woods, a fight I'd carry forever, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The memories of Church Rock were a scar on my soul, their images a pulse of pain, a cry from Dineta that deepened my fight for the land, a truth that burned in my heart. The memories pushed me to keep going, to keep fighting the good fight for my people in our land, even when the odds felt stacked against us. The fight was a fire, its purpose a shield, a Navajo's vow to protect, a scientist's mission to heal, a truth that carried me forward, a mistra that pulsed in the dark. But above all, the spill had exposed how little the government prioritized Navajo lands. Church Rock was a hard lesson in reality. United Nuclear barely cleaned up one of the 100 tons of spilled waste, and the Puerto River stayed toxic with radium levels still far above safe limits. Families were still too afraid to drink from their wells, herders were losing livestock, and the deep distrust of federal promises grew even deeper. The fear was a wound, the loss a cry. A Navajo's kin betrayed by greed, a scientist's data a call to act. I carried the weight of what I had seen, the hermit's groans, the fawn's twisted limbs, and used it to drive my work forward. The man was a ghost, his groans a pulse, the deer a shadow, its deformities a scar, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. There were no easy fixes, no heroes swooping in to save the day. The land was still contaminated, and the threat to my people remained. But those 2 years taught me to stay in the fight and to keep pushing for our homeland's health, even when everything seemed stacked against us. The Puerco River was a wound, its waters a poison, its banks a cry. Cry for the herders who lost their kin, a Navajo's harmony broken, a scientist's mission to heal. The woods were a maze, their shadows a chorus, their silence a lie that hid the land's pain, a dineta that demanded I act, a truth that deepened my resolve. I moved through my new assignments, my boots a rhythm, my samples a prayer, each task a vow to protect the land, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in the quiet, a fight I'd carry forever. The nights across New Mexico were a refuge, their stars a map, my prayers a pulse that carried Dineta's pain, a Navajo's vow to heal, a scientist's search for truth. The spill was a betrayal, its poison a curse, the cave a tomb, the deer a ghost, the sphere a mystery, a land that spoke in pain, a truth that pulsed in my work, a fight I'd never leave. The Ipe was my shield, its mission my fire. But the land was my kina, its wounds my own, a Navajo's duty to protect, a scientist's fight for balance, a truth that burned in my heart, a mystery that lingered in the wood. The forest was a wounded heart, its shadows a stage, its silence a lie that hid secrets, a dineta that spoke in poison, a truth that pulsed in the dark. The man was a cry, his rotting form a wound, a Navajo's hen lost to greed, a scientist's data a prayer, a truth that pulsed in my soul, a fight I'd never forget. The deer was a shadow, its deformities a scar, the sphere a ghost, a land that spoke in fire, a mystery that burned in my heart, a duty that led me deeper, a truth that lingered in the woods. The spill was a wound, its poison a tide, the land a cry that echoed in my soul, a Navajo's duty to see, a scientist's fight to heal, a truth that led me deeper, a Denator that spoke in pain, a mystery that pulsed in the woods, a fight I'd carry forever. The memories were a fire, their truth a cry, a Navajo's kin wounded, a scientist's data a call, a truth that burned in my heart, a mystery that lingered in the poisoned woods, a Denator that demanded I fight, a truth that pulsed in the dark, a fight I'd never leave. The hollow graves. The forest of Cross Timbers Park stretched into a suffocating hush, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and something older, something that made my skin prickle as I laced up my boots. The trail wound deeper, its silence pressing against my ears, a weight that felt alive, watching. The trees loomed, their branches forming a canopy that swallowed the light, and a chill crept up my spine, not from the breeze, but from an unseen presence. A shadow lingered, its intent threading through the undergrowth, pulling me toward a secret I didn't yet know. The path crunched under my feet, each step echoing with a rhythm that didn't match my own, as if the woods were keeping time with something else. I paused to catch my breath, the quiet too perfect, too still, and my chest tightened with a dread I couldn't name. My heart thudded as the air shifted, a whisper rising from the soil, a sound that carried the weight of forgotten lives. The isolation of the park, miles from any town, amplified my unease. No voices, no help, just me and the entity that stirred beneath the trees. Something was awake, its presence a pulse I couldn't escape. I rounded a bend, the trail opening into a clearing, when a sensation gripped me. A pull, a weight that dragged my gaze to the ground. The late afternoon sun pierced the canopy, illuminating 4 weathered headstones, their tilt a silent scream against the meadow's peace. My breath caught as I stepped closer, the air growing colder, the grass parting like it didn't want to touch the graves. The park was no longer a refuge, it had become a graveyard, and the past was reaching for me. The headstones leaned closer, their inscriptions a blur of time, and a shiver ran through me as I brushed the grass away, revealing a shared date that froze my blood. A rustle behind me broke the spell, and I turned to see a figure emerging. Martha, her eyes sharp with a story I hadn't asked for. My pulse raced as her presence filled the clearing, her words a key to a lock I didn't know I'd turned. The graves held more than bones. They held a tale of terror, and I was stepping into its grip. The meadow seemed to shrink, the trees closing in as Martha's voice began, her tale a thread pulling me deeper into the past. The air thickened, and a cold draft brushed my neck, as if the spirits of Ezekiel and his kin rose to listen. My hands trembled as I stood by the graves, the weight of her words sinking in, a history of violence and mystery that clung to the soil. The park's tranquility was a lie, and the hollow graves whispered a warning I couldn't ignore. The creepiest, most frightening story I know didn't come from a John Carpenter movie or a Stephen King book. It came from a little old lady that I met out on a hike one day out near Cross Timbers Park here in Kansas. I was in my late 30s, and hiking had become my way of taking a break from the daily grind. I liked the quiet, the way it cleared my head and kept me grounded, so one warm afternoon in late spring, I decided to drive up to the state park to hit the trails and work off some stress that day. The park was dead silent, and I felt like I was the only one around for miles. The discovery of the graves sparked curiosity. I've been walking for a couple of hours, following a trail near the edge of the park that wound past little clearings when I stumbled onto something I wasn't expecting in a small meadow, surrounded by trees with the late afternoon sunlight poking through them. I found 4 graves. The headstones were old and beat up, leaning a bit like they were worn out from standing there so long I got closer, brushing away some tall grass to read them. The names were faded and tough to make out, but I could tell they were all from the same family brothers and a father. It looked like there was nothing weird about family being buried right next to each other, especially back then. But the thing that really caught my eye and sent a little shiver down my spine was how they all had the same date of death, April 7th of 1859. Martha's approach brought an unexpected tale. I remember standing there, staring at those stones, wondering what could have taken out a whole family in just one day. Was it a sickness of some kind, maybe some kind of accident, or was it something darker? My curiosity got going, and I couldn't help but hang around trying to figure it out. Then, as I was poking around the graves, I heard footsteps crunching behind me. I turned and saw a woman walking across the meadow towards me. She looked to be in her late 50s, and without trying to sound mean, she didn't look like she took care of herself. Too good. She looked sharp, though, and had this serious, determined look in her eyes as she approached. She asked why I was trespassing on her land, and when I assured her that I didn't mean to, and I was just interested in the graves, she softened up on me a little. I told her I was just hiking through the park, and I guess I just strayed off the trail a little too far. And then I told her my name and said it was a pleasure to meet her, and that made her smile. And after telling me her name was Martha, she said she was the great-great-granddaughter of one of the men buried there. The story unfolded with chilling details. Hearing that was kind of exciting, I guess, because it meant that there was a chance that she knew what happened to them. Then, when I asked as delicately as possible, by the way, it almost seemed like she'd been waiting for someone to show some interest in them, without me asking too much. She launched into the story of her doomed forefathers, a tale her family had passed down for years. And let me tell you, the juice was well worth the squeeze. She started by explaining the times her great-great-grandfather lived in. They called it Bleeding Kansas back then. A messy, violent period when people were fighting over whether Kansas would be a free state or a slave state. And her great-great-grandfather, a guy named Ezekiel, found his family caught up in that. And back then, the state of Kansas was flooded with weaponry. The New England Immigrant Aid Company would send what appeared to be crates of Bibles to the Free Stater. But the crates were actually filled with Sharps rifles, or what they called Beechers, Bibles. Back then, the slavers got shipments too, mostly from pro-slavery supporters from Missouri, but also from sympathizers in the wider South. It was like a practice round for the Civil War, which came a few years after, and it was also complete chaos too. So a lot of those shipments I mentioned there didn't make it into the hands of those they were intended for, which brings me nicely to the fly. by-night firearm traders that were roaming around selling stolen or misplaced weapons to anyone with a few bucks to buy them. Ezekiel, I was told, had gone into the woods one day to meet one such rifle salesman. He wanted rifles and shotguns to keep his family safe from the slavers that might raid his family farm. But since he didn't have the time to ride all the way into Coyville or Toronto to visit an established gun store, he took a chance with the man in the woods. But after heading out into the trees, poor old Ezekiel never made it back home. His father and brother started to get worried about him, so off they went into the woods to find him. But then instead of bringing home their kin alive and well, all they found was his body. Zeke wasn't just dead either. He was torn up real bad, mutilated, like something unholy had been done to him. Martha said she was told that it looked like some kind of ritual. Though she'd never been told the gory details, I could picture it though, at least in my imagination. And boy, did it give me the creeps, as you can imagine. The tale's climax revealed a dark theory. But Zeke's family didn't just let it go, and they swore a terrible and bloody revenge against the people who murdered him. They heard a guy in the next town over was selling rifles in the exact same way as in organizing meetups in the woods. So Ezekiel's pa and brothers rode out there to track him down. They asked around, got the townsfolk to tell them where the salesman was hiding, and then headed into the woods to get revenge. But just like Ezekiel, they didn't come back. A couple of days later, someone found their horses tied to some trees near an old wooden church that had been left to rot. A search party went out, found the fallen down church, and then they searched the place to rule out the missing men being inside. But when they stepped inside there, they were lying on the rotted wood planks with the bodies of Ezekiel's father and brothers. It appeared they'd shot each other dead, but no one could figure out why or how it happened. Martha said the county sheriff got called in, who brought his bloodhounds to the church. The dogs sniffed out the trails of the 3 dead men, but there was a 4th scent, someone they couldn't identify. The sheriff and his deputies then followed the 4th trail through the woods until it led to an old cave. But the bloodhounds, who were usually bold as brass, wouldn't go near it. They just whimpered and backed off like they were scared of whoever or whatever was inside. The deputies checked it out anyway, but all they found were some old clothes and animal bones. There was no sign of the 4th person. Martha's belief left a lasting impression. I remember how when she got to that part of the story, Martha stopped talking for a few moments as her gaze wandered off like she was seeing that cave in her mind's eye. Then she told me what she thought happened in theory, or not. What she said sent a chill through me when she said she believed her forefathers ran into the devil himself. She was dead serious. She believed this thing of evil tricked them into killing each other by feeding them lies. She thought about it long and hard, and she couldn't think of anything else that properly explained it. Her forefathers were good men, she said, but that's all they were, men. Martha then quoted a Bible verse about how men were vulnerable to the devil's ways, saying, "Many a victim has he laid low, and all his slain are a mighty throng." I wasn't sure what to think. I asked if there could have been another explanation, or if there was some kind of family feud she didn't know about. She just shook her head and said she knows the devil walks the earth looking for people who are weak or angry. Her family was both, she reckoned, grieving Ezekiel and out for blood. According to her, it made them easy pickings. I didn't argue with her. I could see she believed it with all her heart. And honestly, the story was heavy enough without me trying to poke holes in it. The goodbye carried the weight of the past. 4 guys from one family all gone in such a brutal way. Devil or no devil, it was pretty messed up. And we stood there by the graves for a while, not saying much of anything, just taking everything in. And then as the sun started to go down, I thanked her for telling me the story, and she gave me the small, sad smile. In response, she said it mattered to keep their memory alive, that they didn't deserve what happened to them. I nodded in agreement, thanked her for the story, and then said my goodbyes and got back on the trail. The lingering thoughts reshaped the woods. I tried to focus my mind elsewhere, trying to figure out how long it would take before I was back home and preparing dinner. But no matter how much I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Martha's story. And the more I thought about it, the more the woods didn't quite feel the same anymore. Before they'd been peaceful, but then it felt like they were hiding something in the days that followed. I thought about Ezekiel heading into the woods to buy those guns, just trying to keep his family safe in a crazy time. I also thought about his father and brothers torn up over losing him and then going after the guy they thought did it. Something went very, very wrong in that church. Something bad enough to make them turn their guns on each other. But how was it the salesman, did he mess with their heads somehow? Or was it something else? Something more in line with what Martha said about them dealing with the devil, that cave part nifty too. Who was that 4th person? Was the salesman working alone? Or was there someone else involved? And why the hell did those dogs freak out so much, those old clothes? And the animal bones had to be a clue too. But to what? I had no idea. Maybe the rifle salesman was a crook, luring people to rob them or worse. And then he could have set up Ezekiel's family somehow and got them to fight each other. But that didn't explain the cave or the dogs acting spooked, not to mention Ezekiel's body being all cut up like it was. That made it sound more like the work of some bloodthirsty lunatic than a straight-up robbery. Martha's devil idea was way out there, but I understood why she chose to believe it back then, with all the chaos and death. People probably saw the devil everywhere. He was an easy way to explain the unexplainable. Personally, I wasn't sold on it, but I couldn't shake that idea. And even now, I sometimes find myself picturing it in my head. Ezekiel meeting that salesman, the family finding his body, the shootout in the church, and the cave with its secrets I didn't have. Answers, and maybe I never would, but that connection to the past, those lives lost in a place I just walked through, it hit me hard, and that was enough to keep me thinking about it for a long, long time. The graves' silence echoed with unanswered questions. The shared date, the mutilation, the church shootout, each detail wove a tapestry of horror that lingered in the clearing. Martha's belief in the devil, her solemn gaze, painted a picture of a family undone by a force beyond their control, a tale that clung to the headstones. I walked away, the wood's peace shattered, wondering if the 4th scent, the cave's secrets, held the key, or if the devil's shadow truly walked those trails. The park, once a sanctuary, now felt like a graveyard of mysteries, its quiet a mask for the past's restless spirits. The forest transformation haunted my thoughts. Every rustle, every shadow brought back Ezekiel's fate, the brothers' revenge, the dog's fear, the rifle salesman's role. The cave's bones suggested a darker plot, robbery, betrayal, or something unearthly. Yet the lack of answers fueled my imagination. Martha's faith, her Bible verse, offered a lens, but I leaned toward human malice, a lunatic's trap in bleeding Kansas's chaos. The trail home stretched longer, the woods whispering Ezekiel's name, a riddle I couldn't solve. The impact lingered, reshaping my hikes. I avoided that meadow, its graves a scar on my peace. But the story followed, a shadow in every forest I explored, the church, the cave, the fourth figure, each a thread in a puzzle that defied logic, blending history with horror. I researched Bleeding Kansas, its weapon trades, its violence, finding echoes of Martha's tale, yet the devil's presence remained a question, a possibility that haunted my quiet moments. The masked menace in the forest of Dean. The forest of Dean loomed like a living relic, its ancient trees whispering secrets older than the earth itself. My mate and I, bound by our love for heavy metal and the thrill of adventure, set out to camp in its depths, drawn by its wild beauty and the echo of Black Sabbath's riffs recorded nearby. The woodland, vast and untouched, promised freedom, a pilgrimage to a place where legends were born. But that night, the forest turned predator, its silence a cloak for something sinister watching from the shadows. A single word on a note, leave, shattered our bravado, hinting at a presence we couldn't see. Was it a prank? Or had we stumbled into a trap set by someone or something that wanted us gone? Then came the figure, masked and armed, striding toward us with an axe, turning our pilgrimage into a flight for survival. What did he want? And why does the forest still call me back, daring me to face it again? Me and an old mate of mine from school decided to go camping in the forest of Dean, one of the UK's largest ancient woodlands, a place we'd dreamed of exploring. It's one of the largest patches of ancient woodland in the whole of the UK. And since Ozzy and the boys recorded its Bloody Sabbath at Clearwell Castle, it felt like a bit of a heavy metal pilgrimage, though we loved the dark pulse of metal. We most definitely didn't enjoy the little run-in that we had near the little pond we found. We'd camp rough. We used to camp out the back of my car, basically, finding secluded spots to pitch our tents. After driving up and down forest roads for a while, we found this little side path that ran adjacent to a large pond. There was enough room for us to park the car and still leave room for people to pass us on the path. So we thought that'd be as good a place as any to stop over for the night. Camping there wasn't strictly legal, but we were used to skirting a bit of bureaucracy for a better site. We didn't make campfires or damage any trees or anything. We weren't vandals, so we felt safe unless a zealous ranger intervened. We parked just off the path, set up our tents, and had some sandwiches for dinner. Then, after watching the sun go down over a few beers and some songs and a portable player, we hit the hay with plans to stay another night. Morning brought a shock. My mate found a note on his car windshield that just said, "Leave." We were definitely a bit creeped out, knowing someone had been walking around our tents while we'd been asleep. But it wasn't the first time something like that had happened. We'd dealt with kids playing pranks or passive-aggressive note leavers before, so we assumed it was most probably kids playing a joke on us. Unlike the verbose complaints of officials, the kids or teenagers trying to scare you will generally leave you a nice little die or "we are watching," or in this case, leave. I suggested moving. I asked my mate if he reckoned that we should relocate even if it was just to the other side of the forest, but he was defiant. I sort of agreed with him when he said, no, if the kids or teenagers came back, we'd chase them off in good fun. Refusing to bow to their single-word order, we planned a trip to town. We were planning on having a walk into the nearby town to get some food and see what pubs they had on offer. But my mate suddenly wasn't so keen on leaving all of our stuff alone after the note. We decided to pack away before driving into town to get some food. In town, we found a decent pub had some food and a swift half, but as we were sat at the bar, my mate started talking about going back into the forest and camping in a new spot. The note felt like a blow to our pride. It did feel massively emasculating having moved on at the behest of what were probably just some kids. To reclaim our nerve, we agreed to head back into the Forest of Dean to spend our final night of camping there. We drove back into the forest and repeated the process of driving up and down the little roads in an attempt to find the camping spot. We found a much more secluded spot. We weren't exactly scared yet apprehensive of getting our stuff damaged or stolen, but not scared. As we set up the tents and got our sixers of beer out of the car boot, my mate's voice broke the quiet. My mate saw someone walking towards us down the track. He hissed, "Jay, Jay!" in this whispered voice, and the second Jay was said immediately after the first and sounded urgent in the extreme. I spun around. I turned around fast and saw a man walking down the track towards us, wearing a baseball cap with a jumper jeans and boots. His face hidden, covering his face from the eyes down, was a scarf, and in his hand he carried some big wood chopping axe with a red blade. Panic surged. We didn't try and talk to the guy. I'm sad to say that I left about 100 quid's worth of camping gear and my beers behind, but we hopped into my car the second I saw him. Escape meant driving past him. Since we had to drive past this guy to actually make it back to the road, I gunned my car right at him, so he had to move and couldn't take a swing at us as we passed. From safety, we made an anonymous call to the police from the road, avoiding admitting our illegal camping, but unwilling to let a masked psycho roam free. We assumed it was him that had left that note too, but his identity and motive remained a mystery. Who he was and why he'd done it were things we were never able to work out. The forest's allure faded. We were always a bit more careful about where we camped after that. I researched the area later, finding tales of lone figures in the woods, some tied to local lore, others to crimes unsolved. The scarf, the axe, the note, they linger in my dreams, a warning from the Forest of Dean, its ancient heart hiding threats we'll never understand. Whispers of the barrels. The forest was silent, save for the crunch of frost beneath heavy boots. As a lone hunter ventured deeper into the wilderness, Bear Brook's sprawling woods stretched endlessly, their beauty a cruel mask hiding secrets too dark to fathom. A glint of metal in the underbrush caught his eye, a rusted barrel half buried in the earth, its presence an unnatural scar on the landscape. He pried it open, expecting nothing more than forgotten junk. But what he found froze his blood, a glimpse into a nightmare that would haunt the town for decades. This was no ordinary discovery. It was the beginning of a mystery that would unravel lives, expose a killer, and leave one child's test forever lost to the shadows. On a chilly November morning, A hunter was quietly plodding through the forests of Bear Brook State Park near Allenstown, New Hampshire. The park was a sprawling sanctuary. Its 10,000 acres of wetlands and dense woods, a haven for hikers and wildlife alike. The park spans over 10,000 acres of wetlands and rolling forests, making one of the state's largest areas of natural beauty. But beneath its serene surface lay a darkness that simmered, waiting to be uncovered. The hunter moved cautiously, his breath visible in the crisp air, unaware that his steps were leading him toward a discovery that would shake the small town to its core. The forest was dense, the trails winding through towering pines and tangled underbrush, but it was near the ruins of an old, burned-down general store that he stopped. His eyes caught a glint of metal from some nearby underbrush. Curiosity pulled him closer, a nagging urge he couldn't shake. On closer inspection, he felt the glint belonged to the rusted metal of a 55-gallon oil drum. He heaved it upright, the metal cold against his hands, and pried open the lid. But when he did so, he was faced with a picture of pure horror. Stuffed into the drum were the plastic-wrapped bodies of two young women. The sight was a gut punch, the kind that makes the world tilt. The oldest was likely in her 20s or early 30s, while the much younger girl was perhaps 8 to 10 years old. The hunter stumbled back, his mind racing, unable to process the grotesque reality. He called the authorities, and soon the quiet park was swarming with police, their radios crackling against the stillness. Autopsies later revealed that the cause of death for both individuals had been brutal blunt force trauma. The investigation began, but answers were scarce. The older of the two victims was a young Caucasian, perhaps in her late 20s or early 30s, but with traces of Native American ancestry. She had curly brown hair, stood between 2 and 5'7", and her teeth bore the marks of a hard life. Multiple fillings, 3 extractions. Found beside her was a girl no older than 11, but possibly as young as her lungs were scarred from pneumonia, her crooked front tooth and gapped smile hinting at a childhood of struggle. Police appealed to the public for information, but when no one came forward to claim the nameless victims, they were laid to rest in an Allenstown cemetery. Their tombstone was simple, a quiet plea for peace. Here lies the mortal remains known only to God of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. May their souls find peace in God's loving care. The years passed, but the forest held its secrets tight, whispering only to those who dared to listen. The case grew cold, the barrels a grim footnote in the town's history, but the woods weren't done. 15 years later, near the exact same spot the first barrel was found, investigators uncovered a second 55-gallon drum. It had been overlooked in the initial search, hidden just beyond the crime scene's boundaries. Inside were the remains of 2 children. They too had been dispatched via blunt force trauma. The older child, aged 2 to 4, stood just 3'8" tall, her overbite and gapped smile a haunting echo of the others. The youngest was between the ages of 1 and 3 years old, a toddler whose life was cut short before it could truly begin. She had long blonde or light brown hair and, like the others, a gap between her front teeth. The discovery reopened old wounds. the town grappling with the reality that the killer had struck again, leaving more questions than answers. The police threw everything into the investigation, chasing leads across the country and into Canada. They chased down hundreds of leads, ruling out at least 10 possible identities for the victims in the process. But the names remained elusive. The victims' faces a mystery. In June of 2018, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children breathed new life into the case by unveiling a series of updated facial reconstructions. These digital renderings captured the victims' unique features, the gaps, the overbites, bringing them closer to recognition. In 2020, DNA profiling unlocked a key piece of the puzzle. Analysis of their mitochondrial D showed the oldest victim was the mother of the two youngest. They had likely lived in the northeastern United States for a short time before their deaths, perhaps fleeing from danger. DNA analysis also confirmed that the third child was indeed the daughter of Terry Peter Rasmussen. The name Rasmussen was a dark thread, weaving through decades of violence, a shadow that refused to fade. Known as the chameleon killer, Terry Peter Rasmussen, a serial killer who passed away in prison back in 2010, was convicted of just one murder but was linked to at least 5 more. His aliases, Bob Evans, Ross Musen, masked a predator who preyed on women and children, blending into their lives before destroying them. In 2002, Terry Peter Rasmussen was found guilty of murdering his then-wife, Eunsoon Jun. His method was chillingly consistent. The Bear Brook victims were killed by blunt force trauma, then dismembered and disposed of in barrels, exactly the way Rasmussen disposed of Eunsoon Jun. But the Bear Brook case stood apart. Rasmussen had killed his own daughter, a betrayal that defied comprehension. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. In 1999, a young man posted a message on the website Ancestry.com, hoping to find Sarah, an older half-sister he'd never met. Years later, a librarian turned amateur detective named Rebecca Heath stumbled across the man's post while scouring the internet for clues. Heath's relentless digging uncovered a chilling connection. Sarah's mother, Marlis Honeychurch, had an older daughter from a previous marriage, and their ages chillingly aligned with the 3 related victims found in Allenstown barrels. Heath's discovery led to a relative who confirmed Marlis had married a man named Ross Musen. Heath shared her discovery with Detective Peter Headley, setting the stage for a long overdue reckoning. In 2018, the police announced the identities. The eldest was Marlis Elizabeth Honeychurch, and her daughters were Marie Elizabeth Vaughn and Sarah Lynn McWaters. The truth was a fragile thing, pieced together from the wreckage of lives lost too soon. The family had vanished from their home in La Puente, California, around Thanksgiving, and it was deemed no coincidence that Marlis had been dating Terry Peter Rasmussen at the time. Marlis had fled after an argument, taking her daughters and cutting ties with her family. She then began using the alias Elizabeth Evans for legal documents. Her life before Rasmussen was a tapestry of heartbreak. 2 failed marriages, one to Marie's father in 1997, another to Sarah's in 1994. By the time she began dating Ross Musen, Marlis had regained custody of both her daughters. But this put them in the path of a killer. In November 2019, a funeral was held in Allenstown to honor Marlis and Marie. Their names were etched on a new headstone, replacing the one that mourned them as unknowns. Little Sarah, on the other hand, was laid to rest in Connecticut, closer to her father's family. The fourth child remained a mystery. The identity of the young girl found in the second drum remains a mystery. Her mother is believed to be one of Rasmussen's victims. In 2021, forensic investigators traced the fourth girl's lineage to relatives in Pearl River County, Mississippi. A haunting memory from Rasmussen's daughter, Andrea Steers, suggested the girl, called Jane Doe, might have been half Asian. Andrea Steers believes she met this girl, whom she calls Jane Doe, when they were both very young. But her name, her story, remains out of reach, a shadow lingering in the forest. The Bear Brook case is a testament to persistence, to the quiet heroism of those like Rebecca Heath, who refused to let the victims fade. The Bear Brook murders, having been shrouded in mystery for decades, paint a haunting picture of loss and resilience. The forest keeps its secrets, but the truth, once uncovered, burns brighter than any darkness. The case remains open. The fourth child's identity, a final piece of the puzzle. Rasmussen's shadow looms large. His crimes, a reminder of the fragility of life. But for every monster, there are those who light the way, detectives, librarians, relatives who fight for justice. The barrels in Bear Brook are silent now, but their whispers endure, urging us to remember Marlis, Marie Schrey, and the girl still known only to God,